BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our last session in our course, Sheroes of Resistance, the women who fought back, dealing with African women who were leaders against oppression in all types of various forms. Oppression against colonialism, oppression against invasion, or resistance against invasion, and just general resistance against patriarchy and other forms of male domination against women. This is our last session of the year, so we'll return in the new year course. Well, it's a course that we've been running, but it'll be new for this year. What History Left Out Part 2. We'll go from around the year probably around the year 900 until 1896. So that announcement will be sent out soon about when those classes will start, but it'll start probably around the middle of January, but we'll let you know on the exact dates when that will begin. So today's class, and we're going to go kind of quick today. We're going to get done around 12:15, so we're not going to have as much time for open discussion as normal, but that's cool. We will pick it up in the new year because, although, like I said, this session stops, but we continue. We take a short break, but we continue. And also, if you want to learn more, if you want to engage more with this material, take the time during the break to go to our course website. If you're used to coming or waking up every Saturday and being in one of these classes, you could always go back to the course website and look at any of the previous lectures that you may have missed from other classes. You can read the materials, look at the sources that we use to create these lectures, and educate yourself more and go more in depth on the ideas that we've been discussing in this course, previous courses like the student movement course, the course we did on snitches and sellouts, the course we did on Caribbean contributions to African freedom, the Malcolm and Martin course, so on and so forth. We got so many options to choose from. What is Canada to the African, that course. It's a number of materials up, recorded lectures. So if you're really missing the class, you can keep yourself busy during the break. So today's class is going to be kind of an overview. We're going to continue where we left off with last week and talk about the middle of the 20th century. We're going to be talking about the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, and maybe a little bit beyond today, but really the 50s, 60s, and 70s will be the time period that we discuss. So although we're going to go kind of fast and introduce a lot of things, you'll see two basic general themes that we're going to discuss. So where we left off last week, we talked about the contributions of Amy Ashwood Garvey, who you see here. We talked a little bit about Claudia Jones. We talked about Queen Mother Moore, and these were the women during the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that kind of set the tone and the organizational foundation for two movements that happened at the same time. Actually, we're going to talk about four movements today, and they're all interconnected. We're going to talk about the civil rights movement, and at the same time, we're going to talk about the initial stages of the independence movement in Africa. Those two movements were connected. The civil rights movement and what we'll call the positive action movement for independence in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Then we're going to talk about the Black Power movement in connection with the second phase, or the revolutionary armed struggle phase of African independence. And those two were connected. So we see these connections across the diaspora with these various movements, and we'll note the role played by women in all of these movements and how they were in conversation with each other and how they built off of each other. But the foundation for all four of these movements was laid in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, even go back to the 20s when we talk about Garvey. So that's what we're going to talk about. The first person that we're going to mention is Ella Baker, because you can't really talk about the civil rights movement without talking about Ella Baker. Now, when we normally think about the women instrumental in the civil rights movement, names like Rosa Parks, Mamie Till, the mother of Emmett Till, who they're making a movie about, which I'm glad that that story is being told. But again, we can make other movies that don't have to do with black suffering. But anyway, Mamie Till, Rosa Parks, Viola Desmond, of course, in Canada, and others. Those are the kind of the names that really jump out for their courageous activism against oppression. But somehow Ella Baker is still one of the names that people aren't familiar with, yet she probably did the most to lay the foundations for the success of the civil rights movement. Just like Queen Mother Moore is so influential in the development of so many black nationalists in the 50s, 60s, 70s, including Malcolm X, including the Revolutionary Action Movement and many others, the Republic of New Africa. Ella Baker is really the mother of the radical integrationist approach to civil rights, the approach led by people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and the NAACP and others in the 1960s. These were people that were fighting not only for black people to be integrated into the United States and into Canada, and we talk about the Canadian civil rights movement, but they were pushing radical integration, meaning we don't want black people just to go into the United States or into Canada as it is, but we want those countries to fundamentally change the way they not only treat black people, but poor people, and to bring down the structural inequality in these places. So that's what Ella Baker was doing in the 30s and 40s. She got her start during the Great Depression as an activist. She had worked with the cooperative movement, when black folks were struggling during the Depression. I mean, everybody was struggling during the Depression, but when white people were struggling, black people were double struggling. we can call it that. So the cooperative movement was something that she was involved in Harlem. She's originally from North Carolina. She was educated. She went to Shaw University. She gets her start as an activist, forming these cooperatives, way for black people to pool their money together to buy basic supplies and to own these cooperative businesses. It was a new economic model based really on traditional African values, but it was a new model to help black people survive the Depression. From that, she started acting as an organizer for the NAACP throughout the 30s, 40s, and the early 50s. Very important position. As an organizer for the NAACP, Ella Baker would go throughout the South, and this is a key book, I think one of the only full-length books on Ella Baker's life, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, written by Barbara Ransby. I can not recommend this book enough. If you really want to know about this seminal figure in the Black Freedom Movement, Miss Ella Baker. So this is the book. So in 1940, she became the field secretary for the NAACP and the president of its New York branch in the 1950s. Very important role, because what she did during the 1940s, this diminutive woman, she's not that big, but she's incredibly powerful. Courageously, just like the courage of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who we talked about last week, who went around the South investigating lynchings in the early 20th century. Ella Baker went throughout the country organizing chapters of the NAACP. Incredibly dangerous work, because the NAACP in the South, being a member of the NAACP in certain communities was like saying, according to the white supremacists down there, it's almost like saying you were a member of Al Qaeda or a member of ISIS. That's how the white racists viewed the NAACP, as this subversive organization that's going to rouse up the blacks and cause all types of trouble, when it was inspired by communists, they say. So she would go throughout the South, make contacts with the black churches, the black fraternities, sororities, the black school teachers, all the institutions in these towns in the South, in these cities in the South, and form these chapters, sometimes clandestinely. They had to be secret chapters because the Klan or other white terrorists or the police or other upholders of white supremacy would kill people for being involved in the NAACP. So she went throughout the South organizing these chapters. Very dangerous work in the 1940s and the 1950s. At the same time that she was doing this is the same time as the Pan-African Conference, the Fifth Pan-African Conference in 1945, Congress in 1945 that we talked about. And this is at the end of the Second Great European Tribal War. When this war ended, Black people all over the world realized now it's time to increase our activism for freedom, both in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the US and Canada. Because you had so many Black men who had served in that tribal war, in those European tribal wars, fighting in Europe, fighting in the Pacific. And they're coming back saying, I fought for this country. I fought for Canada. I fought for the United States. I fought for France if I was part of the French colonies. I fought for England if I was colonized under the English. And now I want my rights. I want my freedoms. You all said this was a fight to preserve democracy, that Hitler was such a danger to world democracy and freedom that everybody had to fight against him. But we're still oppressed. So where's our freedom? So a new level of militancy emerged from the Black men and women that participated in those European tribal wars. So when they came back home, when they came back to the colonies, when they came back to America, when they came back to Canada, they were ready to fight for their freedom. Because it's kind of hard to tell somebody after you give them a gun and you've been shooting white people for 4 years in Europe to say, all right, now just go back to being oppressed. It's like, no. You told me it's okay to fight for freedom. So if it's okay to fight for your freedom, I know it's okay to fight for my freedom. So she's doing all this while all this is going on. Then the civil rights movement breaks out in full. When we have Brown versus Board of Education in 1945, 54 and 55 that ended legal segregation in the United States. Constitutionally said separate but equal is unconstitutional. Then you get the killing of Emmett Till, which sparks off more activism. And then Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in 1956 in Montgomery. So this is when the civil rights movement, blossoms. The work that she had done, setting up those chapters for the NAACP, all those connections she made her one of the most well-placed organizers in the country. So when Dr. King wanted to establish his Southern Christian Leadership Conference to keep the momentum of Montgomery up, they wanted to use the tactics of nonviolent direct action that had worked so well in Montgomery in other places in the South to ensure that segregation would fall, that Jim Crow would fall. He turned to Ella Baker and said, you are the organizer. You're the one that set up all of these chapters in the NAACP. You have all the contacts with all the preachers and all the school teachers and the movers and shakers and the everyday people throughout the South, throughout the United States. We need you. And she acted as the executive director, basically the key leader of Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a collection of Black preachers committed to nonviolent direct action. So while King and people like Fred Shuttlesworth and others were doing the action and making speeches and getting arrested and doing these things, she was running the day-to-day operations of the organization. And never given the title of president, but she actually operated basically as the president. But she kind of grew a little weary of King and the rest of the preachers. She didn't like the way they operated. She wasn't, completely against them. She, the work that they were doing was definitely helping Black people. She wasn't saying that they were a detriment to Black people. She just didn't like top-down organizing. She had the same critique of the NAACP, where you had a national chapter which kind of made policy, and then all the local chapters were supposed to just follow what the national chapter did. She didn't like that. She felt local, everyday people should be the ones determining what policies should be taken to fight against Jim Crow and for Black empowerment. And she didn't like, people being so reliant on one or two leaders, because she realized that, okay, if you get rid of that leader, or if that leader turns out to be a charlatan or something, you're going to demoralize a whole lot of people. And one of her favorite quotes was, one of the favorite things that she said was, strong people don't need strong leaders. And if we organize the people to fight for themselves, then we won't need these charismatic leaders all the time. The people will be able to sustain their movements themselves. So that was her critique of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she eventually leaves. But before she does, another movement sparks up, another movement where a lot of sisters played a key role, which is the sit-in movement. In 1960, a number of Black college students at university in her home state of North Carolina, decided they were going to sit in at a lunch counter before and not leave until they were served at a segregated lunch counter. And this sit-in movement spread throughout the country. Young college students, black college students, and eventually even some white college students decided this is going to be their tactic to fight against racial segregation. Well, this was kind of spontaneous. You know, one college would do it and they would make the news, and others would do it, but it wasn't organized. Finally, these students got together and they said, we're going to form a national organization to bring young people into this fight, to join these nonviolent direct action movements against racism and against Jim Crow segregation. So they got together and they formed something called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but that wasn't their first option. The first option they had, why don't we become the youth wing of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference? Well, Ella Baker pulled these youth leaders to the side and she said, listen, those guys, if you join with them, they're going to tell you what to do. You're not going to be as militant as you want to be. These are preachers. They have a certain way of doing things. They have a certain hierarchy that they want respected. You're not going to have autonomy. Form your own organization. Don't join the SCLC. And the students listened to Ella Baker, and they treated Ella Baker as their mentor, as their guide to activism. She trained these young people like John Lewis, people like Stokely Carmichael, who become Kwame Ture, people like Diane Nash and others that were in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they basically took the ideology of Ella Baker as their own. Work with the local people, don't rely on charismatic leadership, and essentially let the people direct what action is going to be done. You don't come into a community as a young college student, and a lot of these students were from the North or from different places, and they would travel to the South to do these projects, to do these anti-discrimination, anti-Jim Crow law projects, voting projects even, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in Georgia. And she said, when you go into a community, don't tell the people what you're going to do. You go into the community, you listen, you sit and you listen to the needs of the community. You talk to people, you make these connections. And then after you listen to the people, you help train the people in nonviolent direct action in these various tactics. And then you let them decide what they want to do. Maybe they're not interested in desegregating the lunch counter because they don't want to eat that food anyway. Maybe they're more interested in voter registration. Or maybe they're more interested in access to certain jobs. And they want to do workers' movement stuff and strikes. Maybe that's what they want to do. Maybe they're not interested in desegregating the bus line because they ain't got nowhere to go anyway. So this is what Ella Baker said. Listen to the people. Don't go there with your own ideas. And they did. They were quite successful. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was a shock troop all due to the efforts of Ella Baker. And you see her here with Fannie Lou Hamer of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who's another Shero that we could get into. She was a sharecropper. She was beaten and jailed for just voting and registering people to vote. And she ends up making this very impassioned speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, where there was at this point in the 1960s, and I mentioned it last week, black people had basically turned over into the Democratic Party. But in the South, white people had it. So the Democratic Party was still the party of racists in a lot of places in the South, including Mississippi. So Mississippi had a Democratic Party that had racist policies, but there was a growing number of black people that were joining the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party nationally realized they needed the black vote. So they didn't want to mess that up because it was a very close election in 1964. Kennedy had been killed in 63. People weren't sure about Lyndon Johnson. There was a Republican nominee named Goldwater. It was very close. The Democrats needed the black vote, but they also didn't want to alienate the South. They needed as many votes as they could. So they had a conundrum. Which Democratic Party is the legitimate one of Mississippi? Is it the white racist Democratic Party that doesn't let black people participate? Or is this upshot Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, which is the black people of Mississippi that say they're Democrats? who do we say is the official delegation of Mississippi? So that was a whole big thing in 1964. But Fannie Lou Hamer gives a speech on national television talking about her experiences in Mississippi, being beaten almost to the point of death for trying to register to vote, being fired from her job, and the economic terrorism that she experienced, trying to register Black people to vote, to just practice their democratic rights. And she's on national TV, and she says, you have to seat all of us. Because they tried to make a compromise. They say, okay, we'll take some of you Black people, and then we'll take some of the white people from Mississippi. And that, she said, no. All of our feet are tired. You have to seat all of us. So that's Fannie Lou Hamer. Another story for another time. But Ella Baker set all of this up. And she said, I never worked for an organization but for a cause. She never stayed with an organization too long. And she worked with these young people, laying the groundwork for the civil rights struggle. At the same time that she's doing all this on the continent, again, those folks that attended that 1945 Pan-African Congress go back home. A number of these veterans go back home, and they're fighting for independence. And one of the first places that gets independence, we already talked about Algeria and Sudan, but Ghana in 1957. And just like with the civil rights movement, you had sisters throughout Africa that were in this non-violent stage of independence. Because in the late 1950s, early 1960s, many of these African countries got independence without a whole lot of bloodshed. Or at least there was some bloodshed. Like in Ghana, where the war veterans were protesting for better treatment. And these are men that had fought for the British, and they were protesting, and the police opened fire on them. This is one of the catalysts for Ghanaian independence. Well, that type of thing happened, but they weren't really wars for independence. Independence was granted to places like Nigeria and Ghana, and let's say even Congo, even at the beginning, relatively peacefully. They say, you want independence? First, they try to say, we'll go slow. We'll give you self-government. And then when we feel like you're ready, we'll give you independence. But the people said, no, we want independence now. And they protested. And they engaged in strikes and other activities that were non-violent direct action against colonization, what Nkrumah in Ghana called positive action. And this worked. It led to independence for a number of places in the early 1960s. Women played a key role in this. One example in Ghana is Hannah Kojo. She joined the original Nationalist Party in Ghana, which was the United Gold Coast Convention. Remember, Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. That was the name of the colony. But the UGCC had a kind of elitist and go slow attitude. They wanted independence, but they were willing to work with the British, and they just wanted self-government. They weren't necessarily for independence immediately, and they weren't for any radical split with the British. The young people that were originally involved in the UCC, led by Kwame Nkrumah, who had attended that Fifth Pan-African Conference, Congress eventually leave the UGCC and form the Convention People's Party, the CCP. When they do, this party attracts young people, it attracts women, and it attracts radicals and workers, people that say, we want independence now, and we want a complete structural change in Ghana. We want a Ghana that's going to serve the people. It wasn't even called Ghana yet. We want a Gold Coast that's going to serve the people. And eventually, this party got so popular, in part because of women like Hannah Kojo, who were key organizers. She organized the masses, particularly the women and the youth. She used the tactics of mass political participation. They used song. They used different things to get the young people active, to get the women active, to get the workers active. She was a key organizer, just like Ella Baker. She went all throughout the country organizing for the CPP. And eventually, the CPP wins the elections and is the party that represents independent Ghana, and Nkrumah is elected as prime minister. And in 1957, Ghana gets independence, and Hannah Kojo becomes the national propaganda secretary for the CPP. She's in charge of all the propaganda for the organization, all the pamphlets, all the banners, all the t-shirts, all the things that are going out to get the people excited about independence, excited about this new country called Ghana, because they eventually changed the name from Gold Coast to an African determined name. They named it after the ancient empire further north called Ghana. She forms the All African Women's League in 1957, an organization that's going to bring other African women to Ghana to organize for their own independence, because that's what Ghana was all about. Nkrumah said at Ghana's independence that it was meaningless unless it was linked up to the liberation of the entire African continent. And women like Hannah Kojo took that to heart, and they organized other African women. And I just love how all these things connect. See, we'll see pictures like this, and we know stories like this of, in 1957, Nkrumah inviting Dr. King to Ghana's independence. And King went and he brought his wife, and they had a good time, and they saw an independent African nation. But what we don't see is the role played by Ella Baker and Hannah Kojo in making this moment possible. Without Ella Baker, we wouldn't know Dr. King. Well, I mean, we might, but it would have been a lot more difficult for King to get national and international recognition without the foundation laid by Ella Baker throughout her work in the 1940s and her organizing efforts. If it wasn't for women like Hannah Kojo, the Convention People's Party of Nkrumah would not have been as widespread in Ghana. These great men that we talk about, who we love and we honor, and they, they're great ancestors, they made great contributions. They didn't do it alone. They had a lot of support from the masses. The masses make history, not just individuals. And including in the masses, and one thing that we often overlook, which we try to rectify in this class, is the role of sisters, our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, the women in these struggles that did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the organizing and fighting for these things. And again, we see the influence of Queen Mother Moore in this struggle as well, because Ghana is going to be the place, the spot where the Pan-African movement in the 1960s emerges from. And Ghana, Malcolm goes to Ghana, and we talked about how Queen Mother Moore was responsible for Malcolm X's education on Africa. Every time Malcolm gave a speech and he's talking about the Mau Mau in Kenya, he's talking about the situation in the Congo, he's talking about what's happening in South Africa, that's all because, or partially, mostly because, the tutelage of Queen Mother Moore and her sister Eloise Moore to Malcolm's development of Pan-African consciousness. Not just Black nationalism, but Pan-African consciousness. And he's in Ghana with people like Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was the widow of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Maya Angelou, who lived in Ghana for a while, a long time. And he was there organizing for the rights of Black people internationally. So you see the efforts of all of these women represented in these men whose names that we know, but the women who, pushed them and laid the foundations for them, oftentimes their names get lost. Another woman I'll mention, and then we'll take a quick break before we get into our next session, is Jean Martin Cisse, who was one of the key organizers from the French colony of Guinea. And Guinea was unlike the other French colonies in West Africa. And Guinea was really close with Ghana, because in 1958, the French, seeing all this independence stuff happening, French realized they were in a very weakened position because, the Germans had invaded France. France was weak. If it wasn't for the United States and England coming to their aid, they still would probably be under Nazi control. So France was incredibly weak. So France knew it had to give up its colonies in West Africa. But what France was banking on was, we have inculcated into these elites in a lot of these West African countries so much love for France that even if we give them independence, they'll still give us resources. Even if we give them independence, they will still allow us to control their currency, because we've trained them to love France so much that this is how they'll be. And in fact, many of the leaders in places like Cote d'Ivoire and other places had that mentality. I particularly talk about Cote d'Ivoire. Had that mentality that, yeah, we love France. So even though we're independent, we're still going to, honor our commitments to France. So are you really independent? But one country didn't. So France gave its West African colonies a choice. France said, all right, we can give you complete independence, or you can become part of something called the French community, where, we still work together. We get, preferential access to your resources. You have to keep your money in our central bank, and then we'll loan back your own money to you, all types of things, but you'll still be part of the French community. The only country to say no to that offer, to say, no, we want complete independence, was Guinea. The Guinea of Ahmed Sékou Touré, who was the leader of the People's Democratic Party of Guinea, the PDG. And the PDG, just like Nkrumah's party, the Convention People's Party, was organized by women, was often called in Guinea the party of women, because Sékou Touré and the leaders of the PDG focused on organizing women, empowering women, such as Martine Cissé. Through her activism in Guinea, she formed the Pan-African Women's Organization, which kind of functioned the same way as Hannah Kojo's All-African Women's Federation. These were groups designed to bring African women in the countries that were not yet free together to figure out ways that they were going to fight for independence, number one. But number two, and probably the harder struggle, how do you create a new nation out of these colonies that not only is free from European control, but also empowers women? Because during colonization, so much had been done to keep women out of politics, economic affairs, in terms of macroeconomic affairs, and what was going on in terms of foreign policy, that it was a betrayal of the traditional African tradition. Those 80 years of colonization had done such a job that many of the elite forgot about the queen mothers. They forgot about all those women that we talked about that fought against colonization, that led governments and led spiritual movements in Africa. Somehow, when independence came, all the parliamentarians were men. All the prime ministers and presidents were men. All of the army officials and people with power were men. This is something they adopted from the colonizer. So the Pan-African Women's Organization said, no, when the women fought for independence, alongside of you, when we organized those strikes, when we had all those mass meetings and we sang those songs and we organized non-cooperation with the colonial regime, we didn't expect to be put back into the kitchen once independence was over. We want our place in political participation. We want our voices heard in economic policy. We want equal access for girls and boys in the educational system. So this is what they were fighting for. Some of their other goals, so mobilizing women and youth, effective work. They were working for effective and responsible participation of African women in politics, the fight for the emancipation from women, the continued fight for the recognition of women's rights and participation in decision making. They wanted to improve the situation of African women by the collection of data and statistics on the African woman and child. And this is in the 1960s that they're asking for this. Support national and international actions to eliminate all forms of discrimination and injustice towards women. To support the ongoing liberation struggles, which we'll talk about in a minute, and to promote friendship, cooperation, and unity among African states. This is what this women's organization was about. Because they realized the fight wasn't over once independence came. And this is something that many Africans realized. Independence came, but unless you fundamentally decolonize, change the structures, you can't just adopt the colonizer structures with black people in them and think that you're going to have progress. You have to fundamentally change those structures. And for women, it was incredibly important to do so because they inherited, the new African states inherited patriarchal structures of politics and economics that relegated women to the back door. So women had to continue to fight. And some of these countries like Guinea and Ghana were on the front lines of that. Some of the more backward countries that were still in economic and political cooperation with their colonizers were a little bit less likely to do this. So you have this struggle. But this is where this phase kind of ends, both in the United States and Canada, as well as in Africa. By the time we get to the mid-60s, 65, developments are changing. So all those countries that have got their independence through positive action, they're realizing that the other countries in Africa that aren't independent, the struggle is going to look a little different. It's going to be a lot more violent because the countries that are remaining are mostly settler colonies. And you can't just have positive nonviolent action against settler colonies. You're gonna have to fight it out. So you're gonna have to move from this, which is, a mass demonstration of the Convention People's Party in Ghana. You got your sisters, they're singing, they're organizing, to this. Sisters are gonna have to pick up guns, go out in the bush, and fight guerrilla warfare against settler colonists in various places in Africa. And then when we talk about the states in Canada, we're going to move from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement, because they're realizing, okay, 1964 you get the Civil Rights Act, 1965 you get the Voting Rights Act, but then after that, Black people are looking around, the youth in particular, looking around and saying, hey, our life hasn't gotten much better, and in fact, we're still being brutalized by the police. We're still in a horrible economic situation. Our health outcomes are still abysmal. And we're being sent to die in Vietnam at disproportionate rates. So how much has actually changed? So a more militant attitude starts to develop in the minds of Afro-Canadian youth and Afro-American youth who are inspired by Malcolm X, again, who was taught by Queen Mother Moore. They're inspired by Stokely Carmichael, who becomes Kwame Ture, who's the leading advocate for Black Power, who was trained by Ella Baker. And they're inspired by what they see going on in Africa. When they see these brothers and sisters picking up guns against the colonizers in Africa, the Black Power youth in the United States of Canada say, hey, our communities are very much like colonies. If you live in a ghetto in Chicago and Philadelphia and New York and Toronto, how is your life? You are exploited economically the same way they are in Africa. You're exploited for your labor the same way they are in Africa. You have limited control over your educational institutions the same way they do in colonized Africa. Your women are imprisoned alongside your men the same way they are in Africa. So they're seeing these analogous situations and they say, well, if they're picking up guns in Africa, we should pick up guns to defend our communities in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in Philadelphia, against these police that are terrorizing us the same way the police terrorize and the militaries terrorize African people on the continent. So this is the next phase of the struggle. And just like in that first phase of the struggle, women played a key role. Women are going to play a key role in both of these movements as well. So we'll talk about that after we take our first break for Q&A. So Daniel, anything in the chat, or are there any hands?
Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning, Rod. How much of a deficit do you think not having this type of education is responsible for the disorganization as it exists today? Example, we as a society treat us with sociality in terms of what we see and hear, but at the time that these credentials were developed, we were not even considered people. So how does that work? The more I come to these classes, the more it beckons me to ask these questions.
I think it's been incredibly detrimental, and I think the main area that has been detrimental is our lack of unity as Black and Afro-descendant people. Because we don't know all these connections, every generation we're still having these internal battles between ourselves. Folks are just narrowly minded. Say, I'm Afro-American, or I'm Afro-Canadian, or I'm Kenyan, or I'm South African, I'm Brazilian, and I only know about this struggle. I only know about this, and this is all I care about, and I'm not really interested in organizing with other Black people. I think that has been to our detriment the most. That's why I love teaching these classes, and more than anything, I love teaching the connections between these various struggles and how these people work together. Because ultimately, in 2022, that's what's going to help get us out of the situations that we're in. Wherever we're at, wherever we look at African communities, the human development is not where it should be. And one of the ways to alleviate that is by working more harmoniously together. And I love that this class has people that log in from all over the world, representing different countries, representing different experiences, and having an education with that in mind, where we could touch on all over the African world and all the different connections, really makes a difference. I think that division has been one of the main things that the way we're normally taught has impacted us. But go ahead, Mr. Thomas, you wanted to say something else?
But how do we square that circle in the sense that the social sciences and the way we were in prison, as an example, still resonate and will resonate for quite some time?
Yeah, we got a ways to go, but it's just always about being consistent. I think that's one of the other things that sometimes as a people we fall short on sometimes. We're not consistent, and we don't plan for the next generation of people to take over this type of work, so that we don't have to always start from scratch. So it's going to take a while, but we didn't get in this position overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. So understanding that, it's imperative on us to stay committed, to stay consistent, and with this. This is why, we've been doing this class for a few years now, since 2018, and we add new things, but we have the same 4 core classes of History Part 1, Sheroes class, History Part 2, and then Early History of the African Renaissance. And then we have our seminars in between. Staying consistent like that is key, and knowing that there's a place where you can come and get this information. So we just got to build more institutions where we're consistent. Whatever it is that we do, bringing in, like you said, all of those social sciences, all of those studies, all the stuff that we can do, we just have to be consistent. We can't leave it sit in universities and only elites have access to it. We got to get it to the people that are actually going to make the change, which is what these movements tell us, that it's not the elites. The elites get a lot of credit for things, but it's really the masses that move our struggles. And only when you educate the masses of people that those struggles actually become successful. So we just got to keep it up. That's all we can do. Daniel, anything in the chat or any other hands?
There's nothing in the chat, and I don't see any more hands.
All right, so we'll get into part 2. So, as I was mentioning, the liberation struggle, it enters a new armed phase. If you want to read about, so we'll start with the Black Power movement first. These are 2 good books that talk about the role of students and women and workers in these movements. One is We Will Return the Whirlwind, written by Muhammad Ahmed, Black Radical Organizations, 1960 to 1975. And he really talks about the work of Queen Mother Moore. He was directly influenced by Queen Mother Moore to start the Revolutionary Action Movement, and also one of the early formations of the Black Panthers out of New York. I was lucky enough to be taught by Muhammad Ahmed at Temple University, and he's one that actually introduced me to the ideas and teachings of Queen Mother Moore. So this is a great book from somebody that was actually involved in the movements. And also A Taste of Power, Black Women's Story by Elaine Brown. She was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the only female, I can't remember the head of their, can't remember the head of the Black Panther Party was called. It wasn't a secretary. It wasn't general secretary. I have to get back to that. I can't remember the title, but she was the only female head of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And she writes a memoir about her times in the party and being a woman in the party. And there's other books as well. There's Angela Davis's autobiography, as well as Assata Shakur's autobiography as well. So normally when we think about the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, these are the type of images that come into mind. And these are the images that a lot of people associate with the Black Power movement. Usually a man with a gun, dressed in all black, a beret, very powerful image. And here you see the founders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, founded in Oakland in 1966. But really, the bulk of the work being done in the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was done by the sisters. It was done by the sisters. Many of the recruits, and this is a party that blew up between 1966 and 1969. Chapters sprung up of this organization. It started with 2 people in Oakland in 1966. By the time we get to the end of 1968, there's dozens of chapters and thousands of members all over the country in a matter of just about 2.5 years. A tremendous explosion. And many of these were sisters like Kathleen Cleaver and others. And these women were responsible not only for the armed defense of the party, because you had so many sisters that were armed and they could shoot and they had guns and they defended the community against the police. They fought against drug pushers in the community. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they also were in charge of the survival programs. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense realized how important survival was to revolution. If people are hungry or people don't have good health care, how can they fight? And if the racist capitalist government isn't going to provide the health care and the food and education for Black people, then the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense would. So the sisters ran a lot of the educational programs of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense that taught literacy, it taught mathematics, it taught African history and African culture. They ran the sickle cell anemia program out of Oakland and other major cities in the U.S. Very important. Sickle cell anemia is a disease that affects a lot of people of African descent. It's something that doesn't really affect white people usually that much. So as a result, the U.S. government didn't pay a lot of attention to sickle cell anemia for a long time. They didn't care because it was affecting Black people, so why should they care? So it was the Panther Party with their community health programs that really started the sickle cell anemia program, testing for sickle cell, giving treatment for sickle cell, all of these things to take care of the community. The free grocery program for elders in the community. The free breakfast program for children in the community so that they could have something to eat before they went to school, because how can you learn if your stomach is growling and you haven't eaten? So all of these programs were dominated by the sisters. And these are the programs that don't get a lot of attention from people that in the popular imagination of what the Black Power movement was about. They only think about the armed aspect of it, but it was much more than that. It was about community survival and community development. And sisters were key players in these roles. At the same time, however, they were also under extreme pressure, both from external enemies, such as the FBI, and we go back to our friend J. Edgar Hoover, who we talked about last week, destroyed the Garvey movement. Well, when the Panthers rose up, he wanted to destroy that as well. And the FBI started something called the Counterintelligence Program to turn various Black Power organizations against each other by having letters going back and forth, supposedly written by one organization, causing friction between the Panthers and another organization called the US organization, and using informants. If you should watch the movie Judas and the Black Messiah. And this is another aspect of the life of sisters in this movement. They suffered a lot. You got sisters like Elaine Brown, who, gets locked up and is separated from her child. A lot of these sisters in the party, these are young women primarily, people in their teens and in their 20s when they joined the Panther Party. And they're living this life and they're trying to build families while at the same time fighting a revolution. So you got people that get locked up and they're separated from their children. So many men are killed either by FBI instigated battles between various Black organizations or being killed by the state. And you have these sisters that are left widowed, raising young children. We talk about the widow of Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was killed next to her, shot while he was asleep because of an FBI informant that was paid to assist in his assassination. And she was pregnant at the time. So she's raising this child now with her husband assassinated. And this was something that happened to John Huggins and his wife. So you have all of this happening and these sisters still persevering in this movement. It's a whole story that we should know about. But they fought. And in addition to those external enemies, they also had to fight in the Black Power movement itself against this black macho idea. Because a lot of brothers who joined the Black Power movement, joined these various organizations, had this idea in their mind that to be men, they had to belittle black women. That to be a strong black man meant that for some reason you had to eat first, and that they would be in these meetings, and actually Elaine Brown talks about it in her book. It wasn't a Panther meeting, it was actually an US organization meeting where they're there and the food is coming out and the brothers say, oh, we gotta let the warriors eat first and the sisters have to serve us. And some of the sisters are like, what are you talking about? I got a gun too. You're not eating before me. So there was all types of these fighting against these patriarchal ideas within the Black Power organization, or fighting for the right to bring up women's issues alongside of the racial issue. Because the sisters are saying, hey, while we're fighting against racial discrimination, we're fighting against oppression, understand that there are also gendered elements that we need to bring up. That there's the oppression of black women, not only by the state, but also by certain black men. And it's not anti-revolutionary for us to bring that up. It's not divisive for us to bring that up in these meetings. But some black men didn't want to hear it. They're like, oh, you talk about that feminist stuff. That ain't got nothing to do with the black struggle. And he's just saying, wait a minute, what are you talking about? We're struggling right alongside you, and you're not even gonna let us bring up the issues that are important to us because you feel like it's somehow divisive. So you had these struggles inside the movement as well. And a lot of sisters wrote a lot of papers and theories and made speeches and wrote books acknowledging all this. And some of the brothers changed their minds. They realized that, you know what, these sisters are right, because these sisters worked on them continuously. Like, you need to check that patriarchy and that black machismo stuff because we in this struggle together. So don't try to make me a second-class citizen in this struggle for liberation. And people like Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael, who become Kwame Ture, and even Malana Karanga, who's a leader of the US organization that had these very patriarchal ideas at one point, realized, and he talks about this. He's older now. That's the guy that created Kwanzaa. He's one of the leading scholars in Black Studies. But he's even acknowledged that, yeah, we were backwards as hell in how we thought about the place of black women. Because these brothers believed that, because of slavery and colonization, that the role of the black man has been diminished. So therefore, we need to reestablish that role as the head of our families by, putting on women second class. But then they did some more studying about African history and realized that wasn't the case in Africa. People were, equal to a lot of the extent. So you had those fights. And again, this is not just in the US. You got the Black Power movement in Canada. You got the Congress of Black Writers event that takes place in Montreal. You got the Sir George Williams University Rebellion, which is now Concordia University, which again, a lot of sisters played a key role in taking over this computer room in 1969 as part of the Black Power movement in Canada. So key role, and Sister Ann Coles, who becomes a senator, is involved in the struggle in the 60s. But even in the Black Power movement, there were levels to the activism. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense out of New York was probably one of the more militant elements of the Black Power movement. And they would become something called Black Liberation Army, the Black Liberation Army. And it really started out of the Panthers out of New York. And the great example is the Panther 21. These were a group of, as you can see, brothers and sisters that were accused of planning bombings and other terrorist activities that the press called terrorist activities in and around New York. And they were arrested. And one of them, as you can see, is Afeni Shakur and others. And they spend a lot of time in jail. Afeni Shakur, she sound familiar to many of you. That's the mother of Tupac Shakur. She was a member of the Panther 21, this group of Panthers that was arrested in New York. And you can see the role played by the sisters. Part of the sisters out of New York, one of the most influential is Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur is still alive. She's in Cuba, and she's probably one of the most well-known political refugees in the world. Her autobiography, Assata, is a must read if you want to understand this time period. And again, she gives that critique in this book about how some of the brothers in the movement saw women and treated women in the movement, and how they were often be checked by women and by conscious brothers. So this book is a must read. But anyway, she becomes involved in the Black Panther Party in 1969. She worked with a lot of those community survival programs that I mentioned. She joined the Black Liberation Army in 1971. There's a kind of a change in the philosophy of the Black Panther Party for self-defense around 1970. And the community survival programs are given much more of an emphasis than the armed struggle. Some people didn't agree with that. So instead of staying in the Black Panther Party, they formed the Black Liberation Army, which actually had been in existence a little while earlier. It's an underground organization. Nobody knows how many people were actually in the Black Liberation Army. It was secretive. It had to be, because they were engaging in armed struggle, not only against the state, bombing police stations, doing things, but also fighting against Black drug dealers. The Black Liberation Army would come up to drug dealers and say, hey, you're destroying the community with your chemical warfare. You think that you're making this money just for yourself, but really you're working for the same white capitalist pigs that are trying to kill us all. You're working for them by selling these drugs in our community, by weakening us. So you got an option. You can either stop selling the drugs, or you could face armed resistance from us. So they killed a lot of drug dealers, fought a lot of drug dealers in the community. And again, all this is underground. But one thing Assata Shakur did not do is what she was tried a few times for a lot of activities and found not guilty for a lot of them. But one incident in particular on the New Jersey Turnpike, and you go to New Jersey today, you'll still see wanted signs for Assata Shakur because they want her back. And here's the story. What happened? On the New Jersey Highway, New Jersey Turnpike, the police pull over Assata and two of her comrades who are driving in the car. A shootout ensues, and she's shot, and two of her comrades are shot. One of them dies, and one of the police officers dies. They say that she's the one that killed the police officer and caused all this, and she is convicted of murder of her friend and the police. But all the forensic evidence shows she not only didn't fire a gun, but she got shot in such a way that it would have been impossible for her to fire a gun and kill anybody. But they found her guilty. However, after spending many, many years in jail, she escapes in 1979, in an escape that we really can't even, the Black Liberation Army sprung her from jail. And this is one of the greatest feats of the Black Power movement, because she manages to get to Cuba, and she's been in Cuba since 1984, and the Cubans aren't giving her up. This is a story that everybody should know. And it's a divisive story in the States, because you can't even go to some places in New Jersey. You can't even speak in some universities in New Jersey without the police coming and rallying around your talk, if you're talking about Assata Shakur, because they feel like this is a wanted criminal that killed a police officer and we shouldn't be celebrating her. In fact, the rapper Common was going to give a commencement speech, I think at Rutgers, and he was blocked. The police said, no, you're not, because he made a song called A Song for Assata. So they blocked him from giving the commencement speech. But we really have to think about this historically. During her lifetime, Harriet Tubman was the most wanted woman in America. So if we think that Harriet Tubman was courageous and we should support Harriet Tubman, then we should support Assata Shakur, because there are still continued efforts to try to get her extradited from Cuba to back to the United States. In fact, even during the Obama administration, she was put on the terrorist list, which was meant that the United States could legally kill her and not have to even bring her in for trial. When you're on that terrorist list, that's almost like a death sentence. So, we should continue watching out for her and understand that the Cubans are really, really courageous in keeping her in Cuba and protecting her. So while all this is going on, let me move to the continent. Or also, we'll briefly mention, in Brazil, same type of movement is happening. You got the Black movement in Brazil, and you also have the Afro-Brazilian women's movement with the same types of critiques. They're fighting against racism, but at the same time, they're fighting also against gender oppression in the Black community. And Leila Gonzalez was one of the key figures in this movement as well. Going back to the continent, Again, just like the Black Power phase is up the militancy in the Americas, in Africa, the militancy is being up in the places where the settlers are living. We already talked about Algeria, and we talked about the battles against French settler colonialism there. In Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Angola, these are the places where throughout the late 60s and into the 70s, the battles would be fiercely fought, and African women would be right in the middle of the fighting. We can look at this interview with one of the veterans of Kenya's battle against settler colonialism. The British called the fighters in Kenya Mau Mau, M-A-U, M-A-U. But that's not what they called themselves. They called themselves the Land and Freedom Army. So we're going to refer to them as that. But women played such a key role because they realized that in order to get the white settlers out of Kenya, so these are white folks that came from England and other places to live forever, like in South Africa, like in Algeria. You can't use positive action to get them out. You got to fight them. So they interviewed in 1979, and this is from a book called Kikuyu Women in the Mau Mau Rebellion and Social Change in Kenya by Cora Ann Presley. This is a book if you want to read about this movement. This is an interview with one of the fighters, Elizabeth Gachika, and the interview asked her, did women take part in the actual fighting? And Gachika answered, we were doing just like the men. We could shoot and so forth. If the Europeans came into the forest, they would be beaten even by two fighters and then removed because the Europeans could not see the ones who were not fighting. I shot many. I went with the men on raids. The man with me refused to shoot. I took the gun and shot, and then we ran away. Another woman who was with me would go look for Europeans, and if they yelled, we would shoot them. We were the ones who fought for freedom, not the ones who told you about the cooking. So I like that last line. We were the ones who fought for freedom, not the ones who told you about the cooking. The interviewer asked, did the men feel resentment because of your shooting? And she said, men were the ones who were giving us strength to fight. It was the men who wanted us to continue to ask for freedom. With this fight, we were all together. Even when we took the oath, and that was a key part of the Mau Mau Rebellion, the oath taking. And women often administered the oath to be initiated into the Land and Freedom Army. It's like the oaths. And we talked about the importance of oaths when we talked about the rebellions of enslaved people and rebellions against colonialism. You had to agree that you were going to fight unto the death. And there was a ritual that went along with it. And women often ran the ritual, which was something new for Kikuyu culture. Often women didn't give oaths, but drastic times call for drastic measures. She said, even when we took the oath, we were men and women together. Even when I was detained, I was told that Mizi or Jomo Kenyatta was detained and I should not worry. Chief Wahurio was shot, and the following morning I was taken to jail. He was shot because of going against the Kikuyu and following the word of Europeans. The work of killing people like Waruhiu was the work of women and girls. Women were doing a lot of work. Girls are very tough. So she's talking about killing one of the chiefs that was sided with the Europeans, which is a key element of the Land and Freedom Army's rebellion. It wasn't just fighting against Europeans. It's also fighting against those Africans that wanted to help out Europeans, the loyalists in Kenya. So oftentimes these struggles took the role of civil wars as well against Africans that wanted to be on the side of Europeans. I want to just play a little bit of one of the veterans that's still with us. She's 92 years old. Field Marshal, who was the only woman to get that rank of Field Marshal, Muthoni wa Karima. Muthoni wa Karima is 92 years old. She's still alive, and she talks about her time in the bush. And we'll talk about the significance of her here in a second. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind, could you please play that first video where we see the interview of Field Marshal Muthoni?
getagwo Field March Omuroni mwale wa Kirima ijuata kero 1930 na gwitũ nĩ Kenya na itũra nĩ Gateto a rũgongo niĩ ndiarũire mbara itoĩ gĩtũmi ndarũire mbara njũĩ gĩtũmi tondũ baba andĩkĩtwo nĩ Mũngeretha ndũĩ augaga gũkũ nĩ gwake twarĩ ngombo ciake cia gũtua mbenikũ na kũrĩmĩra mbenikũ ĩyo na niĩ ndaciarĩrwo kuo na ndarererwo kuo na ndaneneha na ndakinya gũtuĩka nĩ nguma kũu njũke Gĩkũyũ-inĩ nĩ ũndũ nĩ ndahika na ndahikio nĩ mũndũ wa Gĩkũyũ. Rĩu-rĩ ũkaigua ũkenete mũno tondũ nĩ weherera watho ũcio na wĩra ũcio na mũndũ ũrĩa ũkwĩrwo atũrore-rĩ nĩ mũndũ tawe o witũ no akũrutwo kũmũkũmũĩ nĩgetha endwo nĩ mũrũngũ. Rĩu koguo ithuĩ tũrĩ andũ mahũthĩirwo nĩ Mũngeretha na njĩra itarĩ njega. Rĩu tũgakĩnyitana akorwo nĩ mũrũngũ ũrĩ hana tũkerana tũgathiĩ rĩna nĩgetha twĩre mũrũngũ ũcio tũtioragaga no kũmwĩra ainũke kwao na twathiĩ twamwĩra akũrara akĩoya indo. Rĩu-rĩ ndarutagĩra wĩra ndĩ mũciĩ rĩu tarĩ gũkũ ndĩ ngatwaraga riboti ngatwarĩra Kĩmathi na nĩ ndatwaraga riboti ũrĩa gũkũ home ngatira uga ngatwara riboti. Rĩrĩa ndakĩmenyirwo nĩ ndwaraga riboti-rĩ ngaita ũkĩhũrwo ngatigwo hau nguĩte nĩ home guard. Wona ndahũrwo ndatigwo nyũmba-rĩ atumia magĩũka makĩnjoya makĩngua makĩndwara handũ rĩu ngĩgĩthondekwo ngĩhũrwo ngĩheo ndawa. Rĩu ona mbũri na ng'ombe na ngũkũ na ona ũmũthĩ rĩu ndĩ hau o ũrĩa rĩu ta ũrĩa muona nyũmba ĩyo ũguo ũrĩa yarĩ ona rĩu ũmũthĩ ũguo ndingĩkwĩra ciarorire kũ na ciathire kũ niĩ ndahona ndathire ona gĩthaka. Ndacokire mũciĩ ndathire ona gĩthaka ngĩtũra gwatuka ngathiĩ mũtĩ igũrũ ngakoma sinachara gĩkinya ngarũrũka ngorũra kũu ngorũra na nĩũĩ kũrĩ o mbogo na kũrĩ o njogu na kũrĩ o munyi o kũndũ kũrĩkũ ũgũciona no Ngai tu. Ndaikarire ciumia 2 no kũu ngĩmacaria na rĩu kũrĩa ndĩramacaria-rĩ matirĩ kũu marĩ kũnene no nĩ mamenyire atĩ nĩ ndatonya gĩthaka no kuonana nĩkuo kwarĩ hinya tondũ marĩ kũndũ kũnene kũu mahũrĩte mbuci kũrĩa gũtangĩhiũha gwĩka atĩ na rĩu kũu marĩ akorwo nĩ marĩ ta haha matũmaga mũndũ ũmwe arĩ o Nyĩrĩ ũrĩa ũngĩ arĩ o Rũrĩng'ũ ũrĩa ũngĩ arĩ o ũguo akorwo nĩ ta haha tũikarĩte ngati cia kũrangĩra harĩa tũikarire.
Thank you, Daniel. So I just wanted you to hear her words, because again, she's still alive, she's still with us. And anytime we can hear the words of these elders that participated in these struggles, it's important for us to do so. But she talked about fighting this guerrilla war against the white settlers. She, along with thousands of other Kikuyu women, supported the guerrilla fighters, were the guerrilla fighters. So when you're fighting the guerrilla war, it's really important that you have the support of the masses. If you don't have support of the masses in the guerrilla war, you won't win. So what these Africans did, they went out into the bush, and they've had these military bases. Well, when you're out there, you're not farming. You gotta get supplies. You need medicine. You need information. Women were the ones that set up these networks of information going back and forth between what was going on in the rural areas and the urban areas and what was going on in the guerrilla bases. Food, medicine, supplies, going from place. Women orchestrated all of that. And women engaged in the fighting against both the white settlers and against the loyalists, those Kenyans that decided they were going to operate with the Europeans. They were detained and imprisoned, especially when the British started the Emergency Act and just started imprisoning people. And they suffered in the detention. But ultimately, through their efforts, they were able to get free. And in 1963, Kenya gets independence. However, while they were in the struggle, they lost so many comrades, including Dedan Kimathi, who she talked about. They grew their hair into locks while they were struggling to fight for this Kenya, and they gave up a lot. Field Marshal Wakarima in particular suffered 2 miscarriages. She never had children. Suffered 2 miscarriages during the fighting, and she said, "Kenya is my child." This is how she thinks about the nation, because she lost her pregnancies in the struggle, and she couldn't have kids anymore. So she said, "I birthed Kenya." The struggle of me, my sisters and brothers in the struggle birthed Kenya. When the struggle was over and she saw what Kenya had become in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, she said, "We're still not free. Yeah, we're independent, but we haven't truly decolonized." I look at the situation of the young people, I look at the situation of women, I look at the situation of our political elite, and we're still not free. So I'm not going to cut my locks because the struggle continues. And it wasn't until last year that she actually finally cut her locks, where she said, "You know, I think Kenya is on the right track. I'm going to leave it to the young people to continue fighting." And at 91 years old, she finally cut her locks. And it was a very spiritual and powerful ceremony when this happened. And I just want to play this a little bit before we close out. So Daniel, could you play that last part, that last video? That was the first lady of Kenya that actually did the cutting. So they wrapped her here in Kenya, and they're going to put it in a museum. So they did decide to do that because it's part of history. This 6 foot of locks that she's had since the liberation struggle, since the 1950s, they're going to put in a museum. But I love that symbolism. She said, "No, I'm not going to cut it until I feel as though Kenya is really decolonized and really free." And this is a symbol for all of Africa and the entire African world. And we're going to stop a little early today, but this is key, because as these women fought in Kenya, in Mozambique, in South Africa, people like Winnie Mandela, Josina Michelle, as they fought in the Black Power movement, they fought in Brazil, and they fought in the Caribbean, as they fought in Haiti, and so many other places. But the question that we got to ask ourselves is, are we free? Are we truly free? Free to develop, free from various forms of oppression, free from being reliant on other people? Are our sisters free? Or are they still dealing with male chauvinism and all these ideas that we have? You know, and that stuff being fueled by colonialism and backwards religious teachings. Are we really free? Can we all truly say that we could cut off our proverbial lives? Or is there still more work to be done? Do we still have to continue to fight? I think the fight still continues, to be honest, throughout the African world. And participating in like classes like this gives us the knowledge of our history, the Sankofa, to learn from our past, to make our future better. So maybe one day we can feel like her and we could cut our proverbial locks. We could say that, all right, we've done what we need to do and we're free. I think that struggle still continues. I know we're going to still continue. We're going to come back in the new year with new classes, new sessions. I hope you still join us. You tell other people. Use the course websites. And with that, we're going to have to stop there today. Any final questions? We got time for maybe 2 questions. If anybody has any questions, comments, or announcements before we close up. Daniel, anything in the chat?
I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay. If there's no comments or questions, we'll close up today. One announcement, Jaku Combat is having its Kwanzaa program on December 30th. If you're interested in getting tickets, you can contact Jaku Combat, call the office, reserve your tickets. If anyone needs tickets, we have a few through the mentorship program that are available. Just let me know if you're interested and we can put you on that list. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
I've been hearing about the Black Power movement since the 60s. And this is the first time I think I've heard anything real positive as to its organization and its outcome.
Yeah, you don't, a lot of bad press, but as we move forward, we're going to try to rectify that. Maybe we'll even do a whole class on that. Daniel, I've seen something pop up in the chat. And also with that, remember, everything that was going on in Kenya and in Mozambique, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was popularizing these things among Africans in America. They would show images of women in the Land of Freedom Army, particularly women in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea, in their newspaper, and would write about what was going on in Africa. So these weren't isolated struggles. They were all influencing each other. Daniel, I think I saw something pop up in the chat, but I couldn't read it.
Yeah, that's just somebody saying thank you very much.
Was there something before that? I thought I saw the question.
What an excellent way to end the year.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, everyone. We'll talk soon. You'll look out in your emails for information about the next course. Use the course website to get more information. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll talk soon. And thank BIA Media for putting this on and recording these sessions and having them up on YouTube so you can share them with other people. You know, hopefully we see some of you here in the new year. You can come to the space and we can engage that way because it's open. So thank you all. We'll talk soon.
Will these videos be archived?
Yes, they're on YouTube and they're also on the course website. Yes, sir. All right, everyone.